What actually, in my opinion, is probably the most important thing to do early on, especially if you're pursuing kind of B2B ideas, is actually product marketing. I still remember we would have days where in the morning we were having like a conversation with an HR leader about an analytics idea. In the afternoon, we're having a conversation with like a CISO about a security idea. In the evening, we're having a conversation about yet another space. Because one of the things that I think is most important in early validation of any idea or anything like that is you have to recognize that it is not so much that you are picking an idea, you are picking a customer. Essentially, the 2016 election hacks happened. And so when we left Dropbox, those elections were hacks were really fresh in our memories. We had given ourselves 6 months, I think, to pick one of the ideas and really go hard at it. I think it took us 6 to 8 weeks, right? And if you work at a company and you're just a regular employee, first of all, you don't wake up every morning thinking, how do I protect my email? That's not your job. We would just see what logos were on other startup websites. And you're like, hey, well, if you bought from that company, that means you're someone who's comfortable working with startups.
And we found a lot of pull from Middle America. Which were like, we didn't think you guys would be. We got pulled out by the banks started reaching out to us, insurance companies were reaching out to us. We're like, we didn't think you guys would be interested in this.
One of the jobs of the CEO as chief interpreter.
The perception that a lot of people have about a CEO or a founder is that they've got all the answers.
Right.
You've got to be right every time you walk into the room, and you don't have to. Hi, and welcome back to the Desi podcast. This is a show where I, your host, Akash Bhat, speak to founders and investors, building and investing in companies between the India-US corridor. And we're back after a really short break. And today on the show, we're thrilled to welcome Abhishek Agrawal, co-founder and chief executive officer of Material Security. Since its inception in 2017, Material Security has emerged as a trailblazer in the realm of email and collaboration security. Under Abhishek's leadership, the company has adopted a distinctive approach. Instead of solely focusing on preventing breaches, they prioritize safeguarding sensitive information that attackers seek once they're inside an inbox. Before embarking on the entrepreneurial journey with Material, Abhishek honed his experience and expertise as an early product leader at Dropbox, contributing to their core collaboration and productivity tools. What sets Abhishek apart from other founders is his methodical approach to entrepreneurship. In the early days of Material Security, he and his co-founders employed a unique strategy. They tested multiple startup ideas by attempting to sell them even before building a product. This pre-selling technique allowed them to gauge genuine market interest and refine offerings before building the company out. So today, join us as we delve into Abhishek's journey from the early days of validating 4 different ideas to narrowing down on the problem of securing emails even after breaches, ultimately building Material Security into a unicorn company. We'll explore the lessons that he's learned, the challenges he's overcome, and the insights that he has for other aspiring founders navigating the complex landscape of entrepreneurship and cybersecurity. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Abhishek. Abhishek, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's a pleasure to host you today. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time now.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So I think I was telling you this before, but when I was doing a little bit of my research, I kept thinking about what are different questions that I could ask somebody like you. And by that, I mean, your story is so fascinating. You don't come from the security industry per se. You've chosen to be in the security industry. But when you were thinking about building a company, you and your co-founders took a very unusual path. Typically, people narrow down to one idea. They try to then go and validate the thesis. They don't find a fit. They'll probably go back and pivot a little bit more. But you guys went with 4 different ideas. That's a very interesting start. Because we had a very similar journey where we narrowed down from 15 ideas to 10 to 8 to 3 and then basically came down to 1. But you went out with 4. So I have 2 questions for you to kick off this episode. One, not a lot of people have that luxury of doing so. But what kind of gave you the conviction to test out 4 different theses at the same time? And second, what kind of clicked for you guys that gave you conviction that security and email security was going to be the thing that you wanted to work on?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think to answer the first part, for us, it was a very team first thing. So me and my co-founders, we met when we were all at Dropbox. I was a very early PM there. My co-founder, his previous company had been acquired by Dropbox. And my third co-founder was his first employee at that company. So we all worked together at Dropbox. And, it was one of those situations where we worked closely together and we were pretty excited to work together for a little while. And then we were also all kind of getting to the point where sort of the stars aligned in terms of timing and things like that. We were all itching to go do something together. And it was very much a team first thing in the sense that we were very clear that we wanted to build something together. And that was really the driving factor. It was not some core insight or some new idea specifically. Like the driving insight was, hey, we're kind of ready to do something new. Dropbox is the kind of place where, the startup bug bites you pretty hard because you're surrounded by incredible entrepreneurial people. Obviously, I had seen the company grow from a few hundred people to, thousands of people. And so we were kind of in that mindset already. And it was very much like, hey, it would be fun to go build something together. And can we do some sort of like structured exploration of what would that be like? And I think, it's not exactly the case that we went and operationally tried 4 different things. I think it was more that we were exploring 4 different ideas, not like we built 4 different companies at the same time or anything like that, right? But yeah, it was the case where because we were more team first, it was kind of more about, can we find something that we're, 1, all excited about, and 2, where we felt that, as you described, a lot of teams go through this process of, you pick one thing, you invest a bunch of effort, then you realize it might not be the right thing, then you pivot, and then you do it again, and you do it again. And we felt that instead of doing this in sequence, why not just parallelize, right? Like try to do a bunch of exploration at once. And really the only way that was possible, to your point around luxury, is that you just have to do way, way, way less for each thing. You're trying to validate with as little effort as possible because you can't go like build a whole prototype and code and all this stuff for each thing and try to do it in parallel. So that was really the thinking. It was like, how do we find something that, we used to call it the hot knife through butter test. Like how does something that just feels like it's gonna click with both us and then like we're seeing some real response from prospects and customers.
That's a very interesting insight there, especially when you talk about trying to, 1, be aligned as a team.
Yeah.
Because I think the Valley has this culture of wanting to find the right set of people that you want to build a company with, as opposed to like being excited about the idea.
Yeah.
I think most times people will bet on the people and they know that in the journey of building a company, you're going to like pivot so many times.
That's right.
And some of the best successful companies have done that. So there's enough proof in that pudding there.
Right.
But for you talked about, obviously you guys had worked together at Dropbox and Moon had an exit before.
Yeah.
Even for you guys to feel, looking at each other, that, hey, this is the person that I want to build a company with.
Yeah.
What was that initial discovery process? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think there's kind of 2 ways to think about it. There's obviously like, I would call it like the intangibles, just like chemistry and like similar working styles, like interest in similar things. And that's almost like a very unstructured thing, which is just like, are you vibing with someone the same way? Do you enjoy working together? Do you kind of attack problems the same way? Do you have similar interests? But then I think there's also some very structural things where it's like, we were pretty deliberate about aligning on. So like, for example, if one person wants to do a B2B thing and another person wants to do a B2C thing, that's like going to be very different.
Yeah.
Or if someone is like interested in something that is going to be much more like sales driven versus, like let's say like PLG or like a low touch sales motion, that's like just implies a very different company. And then of course the industries and spaces, there might be things where there's kind of a zone of overlap where there might be things I'm interested in that you're not interested in, but both, and you're really about trying to find the intersection. So it was a little bit of both. It was kind of like the vibe check was kind of passed just because we had worked together and we knew that our styles aligned. The structured part of it was, okay, let's actually walk through a couple of key things though and make sure we're aligned, and it was everything from like, do we want to build something that's like co-located, we're in the same space, to like, what kind of business model, what kind of outcome are we chasing? Obviously, so we tried to like get alignment on some of the key ways in which companies or founders tend to misalign over time.
That last bit that you mentioned there, to me was very interesting because it came up during my research as well. You guys actually talked about what an exit could look like. Of course, people do talk about it in some minimal context. In fact, first round even walks you through a couple of questions in terms of when is it the right time for you to walk away when you're doing the co-founder dating quiz.
Yeah.
What was that conversation for you guys like? Like, obviously, one of them had an exit.
Yeah.
But the outcome for even Moon from that perspective was very different because probably he needed a little bit of a break before he wanted to go out and build a second company, but he was back building in a couple of months.
Yeah.
So the story looks very different and everybody's journey is so different. So when that conversation happened between the three of you, how did you guys really visualize what an exit scenario here could look like?
Yeah. And so Ryan had built a company before. He actually did leave Dropbox a little earlier and got like a bit of a break. But I think in terms of us aligning on what our vision was for like what we're trying to build, I think the shared experience at Dropbox was very helpful because I think, we were all kind of further along in our career, like a mid-stage. We had kind of seen like a successful, fast-growing company in Dropbox. And so it gave us kind of like a common language to talk about, hey, what is the kind of thing that we're really shooting for here? And the reason it was so important to discuss that early on is that, obviously if you have like vastly different ideas in mind of why you're doing a company or what is the expected outcome you're shooting for, then it's going to create lots of downstream impact on the types of decisions you make, right? Even simple things like, do you even fundraise or not? Right? Like, how much do you hire? How fast? All these things, like they all come downstream of, at the end of the day, like what are you trying to build? What is the outcome you're shooting for? So getting alignment on it was important. We found that we were pretty aligned on it. And I think that goes back to the first point, which is like, we were similar thinking, similar stage in terms of career. But it is one of those things which is, I think, very important to like get alignment on before going too far into the process.
I don't know if this has happened too much in any of my episodes, but during my research, I found our story of Lean to be very similar to like how you guys went about, not just in the early days, but also in terms of just validating, team building, culture building, all of that. I'll come back to the question about how you guys landed on security.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But before that, I wanted to actually talk about, two things that stood out to me. And perhaps we'll even discuss a little bit at depth about this. The first one was when you were validating the thesis.
Yeah.
Right? There's one thing that you guys did, which was you pick LinkedIn to be your go-to, identify who's going to be the ideal persona, speak to them as much as possible, get feedback, not really have anything. You hadn't built anything. You had a couple of bullet points that you wanted to walk people through these conversations. Talk us through that, because this is what we did when we were starting out with Lean as well. We had a bad experience because we pivoted. We started off in customer success, completely different from security altogether, and then we pivoted to security. But during that process, what we learned was, let's not build something. We built something the previous time, took it to market. It was a very different response. This time, let's take a bet. Let's have a one-pager. Let's have a couple of bullet points. Let's try and get some validation here. And after 78 conversations is when we're like, you know what? I think there is something here that we're onto. And you guys had a very similar experience as well. But for us, it was a hard journey of failing the first time and then learning from that. But you guys hadn't done that. Where did that come from and why did you do that?
I think what happens when you're like a bunch of engineers like we were, or product managers, is that naturally you think the idea of exploring ideas and the journey is a product and engineering driven one in the beginning, right? You feel like, hey, I have to kind of prove out the technical fit, or I have to de-risk technically. I have to make sure like what I'm saying actually has legs. And I think what happens is that's just a natural inclination of folks that are like technical, because that's also the thing that is in their comfort zone. What actually, in my opinion, is probably the most important thing to do early on, especially if you're pursuing kind of B2B ideas, is actually product marketing. But product marketing, specifically what I mean is like you're testing out like positioning, and you're testing out like whether there's a value proposition that people actually care about. You're testing out whether you can identify who has the pain. These are, for anyone who's like further down in the startup building journey, you later on learn to call these things product marketing, right? At the end of the day, you're trying to figure out what's your messaging, what's your positioning. And it turns out that that's very, very easy to test, because it really actually doesn't require much building. It requires a lot of thought. So I don't mean that it's easy in that it's not doesn't require thought, but from like a engineering effort perspective, it's something that you can do fairly cheaply. And so what we felt is that the most important thing that we could do is not necessarily like get into like what do the screens look like, or what is the UI, or what are the feature sets that are going to matter. But at the 30,000 foot view, like, is this even positioning that resonates? You know, is there even like a story that a prospect is going to believe about a need that they have, about a gap in the market, about a comparison to alternatives? And, you know, when you try to, my favorite exercise for this is like, even if you just imagine like the most basic landing page that every startup has to make, like at some point in the early on, you know, what's the hero at the top of the page? What's the little paragraph underneath it? What's the screenshot next to it?
Yeah.
What are the 3 or 4 features you're going to call out? Or what are the 3 or 4 use cases you're going to call out? When you force yourself to actually design that, what you're really having to do is a product marketing exercise, right? You're having to say like, well, what's the key benefit? What are like the key messages I need to convey? And that really forces you to sharpen your thinking. I think the nice thing is it's also actually what prospects are going to consume in order to understand whether to engage with you or not eventually, right? Like 5 years down the line, how does a prospect decide if they want to pick your thing? Well, they'll first start with your website and see what it says.
Yeah.
So basically what you're doing is you're getting to the heart of the thing to test as soon as possible. Now, we had done some like technical de-risking, you know, like we were all engineers, like I mentioned, so we knew that like each of the things we were talking about should be technically feasible. Like obviously we hadn't built each aspect of it, or we hadn't built much at all, but it's not like it was something where it's like, okay, we're not even sure this is possible. They were all things that, assuming the idea and the positioning and stuff are right, should be things that are feasible to build. So where it came from was really just this need of like, okay, if we really are trying to pick amongst 4 or 5 pretty different ideas. I think we had one idea that was like in the HR analytics space and another in security. So like they were pretty disparate. And so if you're trying to, in parallel, validate these as fast as you can, it's almost like a necessity's mother of invention thing. It's like, well, you cannot invest that much in any one of them.
Right.
So what can you do? Well, you can quickly test the messaging and the positioning.
Yeah, it's really important to put yourself also in the buyer's shoes to understand what kind of like lands, what's not landing. And also at the same time, when you realize what's landing and what's not, you got to make those switches in your next pitch.
Yeah.
It could be a 30-minute conversation you have right now and you're like, perfect, this has landed so well.
Yeah.
And maybe you walk into the next call and it doesn't at all.
Right.
And you need to like quickly synthesize why it worked with one persona. Maybe it's the same persona, maybe it's a different market, maybe they're adjacents. Why is it not working? That collation of information and then synthesizing that to like see what's actually worked in a very short period of time, it's very hard, especially when you're doing context switching, like you mentioned.
Yes.
With different ideas.
Yes.
And
Yeah, we would have
this in mind.
I still remember we would have days where, you know, this was in probably the first month or two, where in the morning we were having like a conversation with an HR leader about an analytics idea. In the afternoon, we're having a conversation with like a CISO about a security idea. In the evening, we're having a conversation about yet another space. And you're like, yeah, it's like exhausting, you know? But I will say another thing that you learn very quickly is, and I think this is something that like a lot of founders or first-time founders don't always pay attention to. It's kind of like you have to also see which conversations are giving you energy. Because I think when you are in these team-first situations where you're like, you've decided you want to start a company, but you don't quite know what you're sometimes feeling is like, it can feel like you're forcing it. It can feel like, hey, I'm like really trying to make something work where there isn't really something.
Yeah.
And it's very confusing because by definition, a startup is something where it's like you're trying to will it into existence. And so of course there's going to be some like friction and resistance. But I think it's important to kind of listen to your gut and be like, hey, I just had this 30-minute conversation with, let's say, someone in X industry. And it's like, it was just not that exciting for me to talk. That conversation is just not as fun as this other conversation, which was in Y industry. And that is a really important thing to pay attention to, because one of the things that I think is most important in early validation of any idea or anything like that is you have to recognize that it is actually not so much that you are picking an idea, you are picking a customer.
That's right.
And this is really important because an idea is actually very easy to morph and change and sometimes entirely pivot, like you said. A customer is much harder to do that in. Like, let's say you've gone and for 6 months you've been talking to security folks, and now you've built up all this context, understanding of what security people think about, where to find them. You've hopefully made some connections. You've built up a network. You understand their problems. Now, if you decide, actually, I don't want to serve security people at all, it's a little bit like all of that 6 months is a little bit down the drain. Whereas if you say, look, I'm pretty sure I want to do something for security, and here's like 4 or 5 adjacent ideas that might all be kind of security related, it's very easy to go from one of those ideas to another idea, right? Yeah. So another way to say that is in the earliest days, if you find yourself in the situation where you're kind of team first, you've decided you want to start a company, but you're searching for an idea or an insight, I would actually say frame it as searching for a customer first. And then once you've narrowed in on a customer, you can search for like the specific, pain point for that customer that you're going to have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It's so hard to like move industries, move customers. It's also probably why a lot of security founders stick to security when they're starting their second and third companies. It may not be in the same vertical, but it's within the security industry because they understand the space so well.
Definitely.
But the need and the issues across the industry are so many that they can easily like switch contexts.
Right.
And it's not that difficult within the world of security. I haven't found that applicability across any other sector as much as I've seen it within the world of security.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partially downstream of the fact that it's just such a broad set of use cases and it's just a very, very broad problem surface area, right? So the same security team in any given day is dealing with like completely different, problems, like all the way from like a compliance or like, corporate issue all the way to like a production issue that's like much more like closer to like production engineering. And yeah, of course, in larger companies, these might be security teams that are slightly different or they have different mandates, but ultimately it's all within the security discipline, right? And it's like, it's a pretty broad discipline.
Yeah. One of the other points that you made there was you were talking about understanding where to get the information from and how do you synthesize that information, right?
Yeah.
It's also very important to like know the false positives and false negatives when it comes across those conversations, because you talked about being energized by those conversations when you leave either a meeting or you leave a discovery conversation.
Yeah.
To me, it's also very important to like position those conversations from a point of view of, hey, this is our opinion and I want you to challenge us on it.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, give me feedback.
Right.
Because I think most times what ends up happening is when you ask somebody for feedback, we used to do this in the early days. We were like, hey, this is a feedback call. We're not selling anything. We're trying to build something. And people would come and be trying to be nice to us. They wouldn't want to let us down easy.
Yeah.
And we changed that earlier on as well. And we said, hey, this is how we think the industry should work. And 2 of the 3 founders on our team didn't come from security. So taking that opinionated stance was also so hard. But Neil would drive those conversations because he was a CTO. He was from the security industry. He knew how to like talk to developers. But we came with that thesis of, hey, this is how we think. And then people start challenging us and said, what if this happens? What if that? What if this? What if those conversations were so helpful to then for us to like fall in love with the problem. That now today when we want to like expand and move into other adjacent spaces and build this company out as every company's dream is to be more of a platform. For us, it's how do we then use this to be the underlying core problem, and then how do we build from this so that people don't really feel we're distracted or we're doing too many things at the same time. And I think it's really important to have that opinionated stance and have that one thing that you can then kind of like diversify and move from.
I completely agree. I think that the most opinionated stance you can possibly have is when you're trying to sell something. Right? And so we very early on were like in a sales mindset. And that was because we just felt that is the fastest way to get true feedback, right? Like if you want true feedback, you ask someone to open their wallet, you'll very quickly get true feedback, right? So I think even when we hadn't really built out a ton of product yet, and these are all it's a spectrum. So I'm not over the course of the first few months and years of the company, of course we were making progress on a bunch of fronts, but we did kind of start selling way before there was something to actually buy, and the way we did that is we basically started selling the idea of like an early access or a wait list, right? So we're like, hey, we're currently building this, it's going to be ready in X months, we have like introductory pricing, or like we are collecting like the earliest, like, nowadays design partnerships are fairly common, but back then it was still like somewhat novel. So we're like, for design partners, we're offering this kind of price, and you were really testing if someone was like, okay, yeah, I want to sign up for this waiting list, or I want to put my kind of name by something, versus, look, that was a cute idea. I was trying to be nice. I was trying to give you some feedback, but it's not really a need I have.
Did they have like an end horizon when you were talking about these early design partnerships? You were saying, hey, sign up, but the product's going to be available in like 5 months, 4 months. Did they have something to look forward to? Or is it more about, hey, we're building this wait list, but we're also gathering information as to what will be the first version of the product that we're going to build?
No, I think we were very, to your point, we were trying very hard to not make it seem like just like a feedback kind of gathering exercise. So we were pretty explicit, like in January, we're having a product like that's going to be available. It's going to have these 2 or 3 things that it's going to do. We're, only taking X people onto a wait list for it. Would you like to be one of those people? And what happens is that like starts seamlessly at some point bleeding into just your normal day-to-day like sales, because as your product matures, now at some point you go from like gathering your earliest design partners to just doing sales, and I think that transition is also like blurry. I think a lot of folks assume that they're in X mode for a few months and then they are in Y mode, and it's normally not that cut and dry. It's sort of like you just one day you're like, well, why am I? Yeah, one day you're like, well, why am I still pitching like a early access design thing? Like the product's there now, so I can just sell you on this. So I think, we were trying pretty hard to actually make it a concrete thing that someone could opt into.
I love that. Now, coming back to the question that we didn't answer.
Right?
The opposite.
Right.
How did you guys land up with security towards the end?
Yeah. So the origin story of Material is that we actually, even as we were trying out these 4 or 5 different ideas, there was one idea that Ryan, my co-founder, and it's less the idea, but the problem that he got really interested in, and as a result, we also were interested in as we started exploring, is essentially the 2016 election hacks happened.
Yeah.
And so when we left Dropbox, those elections were hacks were really fresh in our memories. And, I didn't personally come from like a security background, but this was like, not security news. This was like national news, right? Like Hillary's campaign chairman got his email hacked. All of his email was posted on WikiLeaks. There was lots of, downstream damage of that. Regardless of your politics, it was kind of like, why is email security playing a role in an election, right? And so that got us interested in the problem and it was like a very simple question. It's like, and it's one of those situations where like, when you're not day-to-day in the industry, you have the luxury to ask like, kind of like naive questions that can sometimes be pretty insightful. So in our case, we were just like, we thought email security is this like solved thing. Like, like how is email security still playing this big role? And also, if I can hack someone's account and influence an election, like I'm going to find a way to hack someone's account, like this. So we were basically really obsessed with this idea that if this is a problem that can have this massive of a consequence, then why isn't there more energy in trying to solve it?
Yeah.
And as we sort of unpacked the problem, what we realized is at the time, because it was John Podesta's personal Gmail account, there really wasn't anything in the email security industry that you could buy to help you with that account, because most email security products at the time, and still today, they would ask you to change the DNS so that they could reroute email, intercept it on the way in or intercept it on the way out. The thing is, you don't get to do that on a Gmail account because the DNS is owned by Google, right? Google, yeah. And so we were like, hey, this is weird. You have this problem where there's clearly high consequences on this account, and yet there's a market failure in that nothing in the traditional industry can actually address it. So that was the spark, and it really got us thinking about what can we do for this. And long story short, we realized that the what you can do is work with APIs, and those same APIs are available not just in personal accounts but also corporate accounts, and it led to a lot of insights. But the key thing was really analyzing this specific problem of what happened in the election hacks. How we got conviction is, in your early conversations, you start talking to folks that are like much deeper in the industry or space, and you're expecting to be told, oh, it won't work for X reason or Y reason or Z reason, because you're new to it and you probably have some kind of assumptions. And I think we were just kind of lucky in that a lot of the early folks we talked to were very encouraging, and specifically, instead of hearing, oh, this won't work for X, Y, Z reason, we heard, oh, that's a pretty novel take on the problem. That's pretty clever. Like, you should pursue that. And again, this is where validating a few things in parallel is really helpful because you have a comparison point, right?
Yeah.
So we were hearing in one conversation in the morning, we were hearing something like that, like, oh, that's pretty clever. And we were getting really excited pitching it. And then in the afternoon, we were like pitching idea B and it wasn't really resonating, or we were like, you could tell we were like kind of forcing it ourselves to try to make it sense. And so when you have that comparison point, then it becomes really clear. Well, like in the morning, I felt like energy level here. And in the afternoon, I felt like energy level here. Like this is clearly one is better than the other.
Yeah.
And so when you had enough of that, we had given ourselves like 6 months, I think, to pick one of the ideas and really go hard at it. I think it took us like 6 to 8 weeks to land because it was just so clear. Like it was just one was just way more exciting to us than the others.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the questions that when I get this all the time, right? So when we were at the VC fund and we would come across a company that was trying to go after an incumbent,
yeah,
the most obvious question in the room would be why can't an X do this?
Yeah.
I'm sure you got asked something very similar in the early days as
Yeah.
well, where like, why can't Google kind of like do
Yeah.
this for its Gmail suite,
Yeah.
and Microsoft for its, and so on and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah.
Did you face that question, or did that thought even cross you guys? Because this is such a big scandal at that point of time that you felt like, hey, maybe the incumbents are going to look at this a little bit more seriously, and we might be going up against them. How did that sentiment kind of like go down with you, the investors you spoke with?
Yeah.
And more importantly, when you were building, you knew at some point of time these giants would wake up.
Yeah, look, I mean, we absolutely got that question all the time. I don't think you can be in the security world, or frankly, at this point in any B2B space, and not have some large platform that could build the thing you're talking about tomorrow, right? Especially in security, if you think about it, by definition, you're always securing a surface that has some native security, right? So like if you're security for the cloud, well, the cloud provider has its own security thing. If you're security for the endpoint, well, like the OS has its own security. So you're always competing with something that like comes natively or in the platform. I think we weren't really worried about that, to be honest. Maybe it was the experience of Dropbox where, yes, it's possible that in the like fullness of time, the platforms will do exactly what you're doing, and you won't be relevant or something. But the time horizon for that is normally much, 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 much longer than you think. And then the other thing is, like there is something to be said about sort of like we call it like the Switzerland strategy or neutrality. Like if you think about something like email, there's really two dominant platforms, obviously Microsoft and Google, and you kind of need something that's going to work on both if you really want to like serve the market fully. So, and then it's not even like this hypothetical. It's like, well, think about like you have a company that is on Microsoft, but all of a sudden it acquires some company that's on Google. Now they're in a mixed environment, or they're on Microsoft, but their partners are on Google. So like it became pretty clear that like even if one of the platforms were to come like directly sort of compete, it's not something that like is as much of a threat because you've got like this neutrality thing that comes into play. So, but yeah, I mean, I think when you're just getting started, that's probably the last thing you should worry about, because the other thing is like, I mean, the platforms, frankly, like they don't care about that use case until it's big enough to matter. And, it's going to take a while before you prove that it's big enough to matter.
Yeah. And what are the early versions of the product look like? Of course, it's come a long ways in the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
But what are the early versions of the product look like? And what kind of feedback did those early design partners kind of like give you, or the people who signed up from the wait list?
Yeah.
And maybe three-part question. Sorry, I tend to ask a lot of questions when I'm excited about a particular thought. One, what kind of feedback did they give you? How do you guys use that feedback? And thirdly is, how much was it more of a intentional push on your side to keep getting that feedback earlier on to improve the product?
So what the product initially is we came up with this idea that if you think about email security, essentially, historically, email security has meant one thing, which is I want to deliver you a malicious email as an attacker because it's a very easy way to compromise you. And what if there was something that could detect and block that email? Like whether it's like phishing, before that it was like malware, like spam. But the point is, it's some bad thing that I'm trying to stop at the perimeter. our thought was that's all great and you should do that. But the thing is, there are other ways into a mailbox that are not just a malicious email. Like, for example, if I get you to consent to an OAuth application that's malicious, or I install a bad browser extension on your device, or I compromise your personal device. The point is, we realized there's kind of many ways in. And so once you are in, regardless of the way you got in, we were really obsessed with what is the damage you would be able to do. And in going all the way back to John Podesta, when they hacked his email, they put all his email on the internet, like 10 years of his personal Gmail, but they also reset all his passwords. So they reset his password to iCloud, to Twitter, et cetera. And so what we became obsessed with is not so much the inbound email security, which is just about blocking at the perimeter, but actually what we called post-breach security. So basically, assume I'm in your mailbox. What are the things I would do? And can I make those things harder to do? So it's kind of like defense in depth. So the early versions of the product were basically, there was something that would deploy inside an organization. It would connect via API to either Office 365 or Google Workspace. And from an end user's perspective, at the employee level, they would see certain protections occurring inside their mailbox that required out-of-band challenges to do certain actions. So, for example, if you wanted to go read an email that's 2 years old inside your mailbox that has the board deck shared 2 years ago, you would need to do an additional out-of-band challenge. Or if you wanted to reset a password, you would have to do an additional out-of-band challenge. And then there was a kind of admin console that was back then very rudimentary of just showing you that how the product's working. That was like the really, really early version. So we were very focused on this post-breach compromise thing. Over time, we also added kind of inbound email security, like the security market's consolidating. And these days, we kind of extend beyond email to things in Google Workspace, M365. But the earliest thing was that post-breach thing. As far as, how to use your earliest customers, man, we were like obsessed, right? Like every day in Slack, we were kind of having conversations. We were watching them struggle with like our UIs. Like, I think we were extremely intentional about it in terms of using them to gather feedback. And again, in B2B in particular, it's very easy because like, there's like a specific human being whose like job it is to like evaluate your product and deploy your product. And you can, if they're friendly enough to be one of the earliest people trying out your product, they're only doing that because they themselves are enthusiastic about trying this kind of software, giving feedback. And so, it was like an obsession, just like, really trying to iterate fast. And you kind of realize like the speed at which you iterate will be the speed at which you get feedback, obviously. So like, it's really important that not only are you getting feedback, but you're trying to act on it super fast so that you can get into this loop.
Yeah.
Whereas, and so for that reason also, we were trying pretty hard to constrain the set of very, very first customers so that you kind of aren't bringing in a new cohort until you feel like you've made like, some sort of progress. Like some progress.
Yeah.
And it's a very basic thing, right? Like not a terribly insightful thing, but like really thinking about it in terms of cohorts was also useful.
So do you guys ever think about just going top down when it comes to sales? Or you also thought about bottom up and saying, hey, maybe we'll go directly to the users, maybe have some sort of a lightweight product that everyday people could use it. I mean, at organizations.
Yeah.
And then they are the ones who are like championing it internally and using maybe a PLG-ish kind of like motion for you to like go and experiment. How did that initial debates kind of like go down internally? Or was it always just top down?
No, it was pretty much, we were very clear that this was going to be like a centralized sale, meaning like you're actually selling to one specific CISO or like director of security or IT. And the reason for that is because we were asking for a bunch of access to email, right? And if you work at a company and you're just a regular employee, first of all, you don't wake up every morning thinking, how do I protect my email? Like, that's not your job. But even if you did, let's say you're a great corporate security citizen, you're actually not supposed to hand over the access to your email to just some app, right? Like that's not a great thing for you to do. So we knew that if we're asking for this access, we don't want to antagonize our very buyer, right? So like if you imagine something that's like just getting access to random people's email and like processing it and doing things, modifying it, that would become like a security nightmare if it was being done just by willy-nilly by any given employee.
Well, was there ever going to be a possibility of somebody using it in their personal email and then also having
I
a
see.
corporate version of
Yes.
the product.
Yeah, so that we did do. Yeah, so we definitely were sort of excited because the whole point of the John Podesta thing is like it was his @Gmail account, right? So yes, we absolutely had a product that was kind of geared more towards individuals and their personal accounts. We never thought of it as a revenue line though. It was more just like a way to get like initially friends and family to just start giving some feedback, but also eventually investors, CISOs, things like that, to your point, could try it out on their own personal account and then become evangelists of the approach. So yeah, that was the thing we did, but it was less like we thought about it less as like our primary motion of acquiring customers and more just like a way to get feedback, and also just it almost became like a benefit we could give to friends of the company, like, hey, this is something that you can use to protect your own email too.
Was it easier or difficult in your experience looking back to convince investors, especially early on? I've read about the angels being really excited in the early conversations, especially discovery conversations, where you're also able to like spin it around and ask them if they wanted to invest and put in a small check. But just a little further down the road, when you were trying to speak to institutional VCs, how were those early days of the conversations? What were the initial pushbacks, hurdles, challenges, debates that you guys had? And what kind of like convinced them that, this is probably something that we need to get behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that...
Because I'm sure it wasn't just the political angle that kind of gave investors the conviction that, hey, this is going to be a huge space in the security industry. It wasn't that. That was a good inflection.
Yeah, I would say the political thing was just an interesting kind of example of how bad the consequences can be of like an email hack. No, honestly, like the real kind of story was that there was an infrastructure shift going on. And that was the move of the enterprise and B2B companies into the cloud, which is like obvious now, right? Like, but at the time, you had all these companies, large companies, moving from an on-prem kind of Office deployment into Office 365, or an on-prem email server into a cloud-hosted email server. And what happened is, as they were doing that, there's that infrastructure shift is creating a new opportunity in that now with cloud email, you get APIs. Right. And so it was very easy to tell this story of like, look, there is an underlying technology shift that is now going to unlock a whole bunch of capabilities that literally weren't possible before. Because when you have an email server that a company's running, the only thing you can really do to interact with it is put an appliance in front of it and see all emails going in and all emails going out, which is why legacy email security companies, that's what they did. They analyzed email going in and out and blocked, in the inbound for malicious emails and on the outbound for DLP kind of use cases. Once you say, actually, I can talk to these mailboxes or email systems via APIs, all sorts of capabilities became unlocked. So I think it was like, there's like a technology shift going on that is sort of like unlocking new capabilities. And then on top of that, there's this like pretty universal problem, like which company doesn't have email, which company doesn't have sensitive data in email. Yeah. And then on top of that, you have sort of like unique take on that problem, which is like, hey, let's actually assume breach and say, let's do something about that proactively rather than assume that the only way to solve this problem is like try to detect a breach and prevent it. So those three things kind of combined, I think, made for a pretty compelling story. So I think that the types of pushback we would get are kind of some of the things you were mentioning, like, why wouldn't the platforms do this, incumbents, things like that. But broadly, I think it was a pretty compelling story.
Yeah, as I was, putting that question forth to you, I just realized it was just 8, 9 or 9 years ago that we're talking about, how companies were still moving into cloud. It seems like a lifetime ago. Yes. It seems like this was way like 20 years back. This is just like 8 years ago. We're still talking about a major shift in how infrastructure was being built out.
When we were at Dropbox, Dropbox was selling into the enterprise. Obviously, their core business, their biggest revenue source was their consumer business, but they did have an enterprise B2B business. And we would do like deal win-loss kind of debriefs in the company all hands and stuff. And sometimes when we would lose, it would be to like OneDrive in Office 365 or Google Drive in Google Workspace. And that's fine, but the kinds of companies that were adopting OneDrive or Google Workspace were not companies you would have assumed. Like back then, it's like if you have some large enterprise customer that is all of a sudden adopting the cloud, it was like still kind of surprising. You're like, whoa, like this
We
bank
expected you to do
like
this.
this bank is moving their stuff to the cloud. Like we thought you'd be like way later. And obviously now it is like obvious, but in retrospect, but at the time it was very clear, like this is a shift happening like now. And with this shift, it's going to influence a bunch of things, including email security.
It's very fascinating to see how these changes, especially now with AI and how quickly things are changing.
Yeah.
Just looking back 8 years ago.
Yeah.
We were, and I sometimes have to like context switch when I'm speaking to founders in India, founders in the UK, founders in the US, because geographies are also lagging behind so much in terms of how they're catching up to like trends. Or just changes in the industry. At least here in the Bay Area, we live in such a small bubble, or even here in the US, that we feel like most of the companies, most of the teams still are making those changes and shifts at the same time. But then when you start talking to where the actual, of course, you get when you segment out your revenue base, you see that there's 20% coming from the usual suspects.
Yeah.
And then you have 50 to 60% coming from players who you're like, wait, you guys are also interested in this, but we didn't actually project this for until like maybe like 5 or 6 years. You're coming on board. So there's actually an intention behind, hey, we're seeing the change happening in bubbles,
right,
in the Bay Area and the New York markets, and then we've got to like catch up because that's kind of like where the industry is headed. And security, I guess, is one of those that's probably a little bit more ahead or has been ahead. Now it's a little bit more even playing field with like AI. Everyone's kind of like trying to see how AI kind of like fits into what they're doing.
Yeah.
But with security, I think everybody is trying to be at least at the front of the line, if not, second or third.
Yeah. And, like I think one thing that in terms of like early days learnings is that you sort of get surprised sometimes because you think company X is going to be totally a laggard. This is not the kind of company that's going to like adopt new technology fast, or it's not the kind of company that will work with startups. And you're frequently surprised. And you're like, actually, this giant old company that is very startup friendly. And then on the other hand, there's this like super like, new company that feels like it should be exactly like an early adopter. And it actually, sometimes you get surprised and they have a pretty like laggard mindset.
Yeah.
And so
it's the person it's the buyer.
Right. Not, and so that's the thing. And I think what happens is like normally the buyers end up at companies that, so it correlates, but it's not always the case. You run into exceptions. So you do sometimes see people who are like actually very, have a lot of risk appetite. They're very excited to try out new things, even though they are at a larger company or at a more kind of old school company. And then on the flip side, sometimes you get like really, really conservative folks, even though they're kind of in a company where you would have expected them to be more early adopters. So I think it's actually important in the early days, especially to keep like a pretty open mind and not just assume that, not judge a book by its cover, so to speak, and like assume, because I think you can see some pretty large variations in people's desire to try out, to your point, and it's not always correlated to geography. It's not always correlated to company size. It's not always correlated to vertical. Like you can get surprised. We actually, one of the things we used to do really early on is we would just see what logos were on other startup websites. And you're like, hey, well, if you bought from that company, that means you're someone who's comfortable like working with startups. And that would actually give you like a signal that this is a company that is actually, regardless of what its vertical or geography or size might imply, actually an early adopter.
Yeah. Quite similar to you. We had a very similar experience when we were trying to like, our whole thesis was it's going to be the San Francisco Bay Area market, which is big enough to start with.
Yeah.
It's going to be the New York markets, adjacent markets, and then it's going to be Israel and some of these places that we'll obviously sell to.
Right.
And we found a lot of pull from Middle America.
Yeah.
Which were like, we didn't think you guys would be. Like, we got pulled out by the banks started reaching out to us, insurance companies were reaching out to us. We're like, we didn't think you guys would be interested in this.
Yeah.
And we didn't even know this was going to be an opportunity for us. And that's kind of like how a couple of verticals kind of like opened themselves up to us and saying, okay, regional banks want to use us because now they have small teams.
Right.
They have 1 or 2 people teams and now they need tools.
Yeah.
But we never felt regional banks would have the budgets to even begin with.
Right.
But they're a little bit more forward thinking in terms of how do I build my stack more efficiently?
Yeah.
And how do I not, put that against man hours and getting
Yeah.
a headcount
Right.
and have to fight for headcount budget. It's easier for me to fight for
Yeah.
a tooling budget versus a headcount budget
Right.
any day.
Any day. Yeah. Yeah.
Especially within security. People don't really get the opportunity to like expand
Totally.
teams as much.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. And, you know, in the early days, you kind of, you sell to whoever will talk to you, right? Like, but I think what happens is over time you start getting a sense of where your product really resonates, where it uniquely resonates, and where your value prop is strongest, where you have the right to win.
Yeah.
You know, where your approach is, and I think you know that's all about like finding your like ideal customer profile. And it takes much longer than I think sometimes people think because you have to kind of go through this journey of you know, selling to whoever is talking to you, wherever you find some appetite, and then slowly over time understanding, okay, now that I have this like base of customers, where is it that I'm actually really strongest? Where do I feel that it's the solutions resonating the most versus, you know, where is it like, okay, it's kind of on the fringes. You know?
Yeah.
So
I love that. And, you know, I want to transition to the second part of the episode here. And this is usually a section where we get a little bit more insight into who you are as a leader.
yeah.
And one of my favorite blogs of all time is, you know, by First Round. Again, it's one that's titled "Letting Go of Your Legos," where you know you now transition from you know the doer who is in the weeds every day to becoming more of this enabler.
Yeah.
And you've been through that journey quite quickly. In fact, you know, you guys grew rapidly, especially after you came out of stealth.
Yeah.
And then the subsequent rounds were within 4 years, if I'm not wrong, that
Yeah.
kind of like got you to that unicorn status.
Yeah.
And in that period, you've obviously grown as a team, obviously investors on board, you've got board members, you've got customers who are growing.
Yeah.
You've had to build a part of your, I guess, your own personality
Yeah.
that previously didn't exist. You were an product, you
Yeah.
kind of like dabbled around that space.
Yeah.
You became
Yeah.
a founder, early stage, you were doing a bunch of everything. Now you had to champion internal leaders and you kind of like had to become this nurturer.
Yeah.
How was that shift for you?
Yeah.
And what changes did you have to go through? Was it easy? Was it like a natural thing? You're like, oh, you know what? I found people, I'm going to hand off things.
No,
or was it more of a learning process for you?
It's never easy. No, never easy, never done. I think it's a process. I think, look, personally, I feel like the way to reconcile that is that you have to so a couple different ways that I think about this is like, well, one, you know, it's letting go, but it's also thinking hard about what are some things that like in a company, in the role you have, like only you can really solve and not really anybody else can. And that should be the place where you're spending time, right? And I think that is the ideal, right? The ideal is that like the activities you are spending time on or prioritizing are the ones that you are best suited for. The reality is that you're a human being, and there are going to be things that you liked doing. If you're an engineer or a designer or PM or on the business side, it doesn't matter. But there are things that you are in your comfort zone. They're almost like enjoyable to do, and what I've learned about myself is that often they are the things that give you energy. And so it's okay to allow yourself to do some of those things as long as you're being kind of honest with yourselves that that is something that you're doing more because it gives you energy and less because you are uniquely the only person who can do it. So like as an example, like, you know, I still like coding, and at times I like code up small little things that end up in the product. Nothing complex or big, but like it sometimes just feels nice to be able to open a PR.
Go back to your roots.
Yeah, and it's actually like something that has to be contextualized, because it's like if people are like, whoa, why are you doing this? Is that because you don't trust the team or blah, blah? It's like, no, like this is just, you know, I have a long flight, I've had a long day or something. I just want to like relax, and like this is like an easy way for me to like just kind of put some energy into my tank because it's the thing that I, you know, used to do or feels, you know, like something more in my comfort zone. I think the danger is that when people kind of only do that, or like they kind of are addicted to the things that are in their comfort zone and they're the easiest for them to do, but probably the things that they need to probably start delegating because they need to focus on the things that no one else can do in the company.
Yeah.
And so I find it nice to be able to give myself some permission to do some of those old things with the understanding that it is to try to like create energy and not because it's like required. As far as like, nurturing others, and look, I think there's no easy sort of path to learning some of that thing. It's learning by a lot of trial and error. And I think that where like every founder has had this experience is that when you do make like an extremely strong hire, it actually feels really good. I think like, especially in things that are not in your core discipline that you grew up with, you actually are like desperately trying to find people that you can kind of like lean on and not have to worry about some of the things. Because in the early days, you have this discomfort where every single thing you're doing, with the exception of some stuff, is something you've never done before, and it's like outside of your core discipline. And you're sort of like aspiring to get to the point where you can hire someone that you can delegate to. They're an expert in that field. So I think most folks actually want to get to that point and want to like let go. I think the key is just like having the sort of, if you find like these key hires where you feel like you can actually trust with your vision, that makes just a lot easier.
You got to have that intellectual honesty as well with yourself.
You
got to let yourself know that, hey, it's not my core area of expertise, but what I can do is I can bring somebody who can actually take on that.
Yeah.
And then we work together, and we talk as much as possible.
Yeah.
And then we come up with a good strategy that kind of like works to go after this. Now,
ultimately, sorry, one other thing. I do think though that as a founder, the type of people that are often starting companies are by definition folks that like to not just specialize in one small area, but they actually like to dabble in a bunch of different aspects of company building. And I think in the same way that it's okay to give yourself permission to go back into your little comfort zone and like do that thing, it's okay to also give yourself permission to say, look, the reason I did this and started this is because by definition, I like thinking about the market and the product and like the, hiring and this and that. And I think it's also okay to realize like you are in this position where you have an incredible amount of context and you're going to have insight into any decision, even those outside your core area that functional leader might not have.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just about being like you said, very intellectually honest about that.
What was that for you? Like what areas did you feel that came naturally to you? And what were areas that you felt that you had to focus on because there was nobody else in the company who could actually do that? And of course, fundraising and maybe people culture was something that was like core, but what are some things that are maybe not that obvious that you had to do?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like you said, exec hiring, and that is probably like the very, very first thing that is, core to the job that like no one else is really going to do. I think one that like I didn't realize the importance of, but I think it was like, so one of our investors, Elad Gil, and in one of his books, I think he describes like one of the jobs of the CEO as chief interpreter. And like, I think that actually is a really important thing. And basically what it is talking about is like, it's kind of your job all the time to interpret what's going on, like internally and externally, and contextualize it and make it make sense for the company, in terms of like storytelling. You're just like, okay, well, these are the patterns we're observing. This is what that means. That's what this implies about what we should do on product, on hiring, on strategy. And you're just constantly doing this. And I think it is one of those jobs that like no one else is really going to be able to do. They might be able to do it within their functional areas, but at the company level, it's kind of your job.
They also don't have insight and also overview of everything that's happening across the spectrum. It's you get to see everything that's happening.
Right. And like at the highest level, you might describe this as like, well, you're setting the strategy or something, but I think it's actually more specific than that. It's like you're constantly telling the story of what's going on and refining it based on events that are happening and the data points you are collecting, right? So you close a deal, like what does that imply? Like what does that reaffirm? What does that counter to? Or if you lose a deal, like what does that mean? If you made this bet that worked out, how do we just put that into context? So you're kind of like always refining the story. And I think your like key product as a CEO is like that story of the interpretation of like what's going on in the market and how what the activities you are doing as a company align with that story. That's probably the one key thing that I don't think people always realize is like very core to the job. other than, fundraising, exec hiring, all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
because the fundraising and rest of the other stuff kind of like gets built
Yeah.
into this interpretation or
Yeah.
contextualization as
Right.
which are not a lot of people actually like think about it from that perspective.
Yeah.
So was that something that you had to like understand over time and get better at it? And was there like external help, like CEO coaching or something that you had to do, like exec coaching, or was it more about you just trying to like sit back and think? A lot of people just like thinking about what's happening, taking a step back. It's those early morning hours, late nights, travels, as you were talking about, where you just get a chance to like sit down and say, okay, let me just take a moment, deep breath, and see what's happening at the company.
Yeah, I think it was more that kind of thing where, everybody has their own way of doing these things. Like for me, it is useful sometimes, like to just sort of zoom out, create some space and time, and just like I like writing, I've always like find that writing helps me think. So, but like trying to first for myself tell a story of, okay, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm interpreting, here's what I thought would happen, that was an assumption that was right or wrong, and kind of like refining that for yourself, and then immediately soon after like trying to take that to like the rest of the company and helping them internalize that same story. Because ultimately I think all very cliche learning that every CEO founder has is like you have so much context that others might not in the company, and you take so many things for granted. You feel so many things are obvious. There's so many things you feel you've explained 5 times, 10 times, and you almost get to the point where like, if I explain this again, people are going to be like, dude, we know you've literally said this like 100 times. And yet every CEO or founder has had this experience where you're talking to someone in your company and you're like, wait, what? Like, I thought I said this like a billion times. And it's like, so, I think it's just this realization that is like a core job you have to kind of like reinforce, repeat this thing and refine it all the time.
It's important because you want everybody to be aligned, right? That's what people talk about when they say everybody's on the same page. Everybody needs to like know the mission really well. It's not important to just have a mission that's like lying on a wall or on a piece of paper or tucked away somewhere in your Notion documents. It's actually speaking, knowing, and then putting that into action, especially in their context. If you're a salesperson, what does that mean? How does that align?
That's right.
If you're a product person, what does that mean? If you're an eng, what does that mean? It's really important that everybody is on the same page, and that nuance gets lost sometimes, especially with context, people, timelines.
And I think like there's kind of 2 ways to think about that. Like one is, you hear kind of like everyone should be rowing in the same direction, and that's almost like hey, we have some understanding of what each team member needs to do. Like, let's make sure like each team member understands that, and then they're all kind of like doing their part of the overall thing. And that's very much like almost like a top down, like, the things to do, you just need to ensure each person is doing their part. But there's a bottoms up, which is like, at the end of the day, you hire smart people because you want their help in solving difficult problems, but they can't do that if they don't know the problems. So like, you have to contextualize not just like why you're doing what you're doing, but you also have to contextualize like, what are the challenges? What are the problems? What are the difficult things? What are the things you don't have answers to? And that is also a type of storytelling. It's like, what are the places where things aren't working the way you expected? And the reason you need them to understand that is so that then they can use their, awesome talent and brains and creative juices to help you uncover solutions. So I think it's both for a top down, but also from a bottoms up perspective that you really want this, on this alignment.
It's creatively leveraging your vulnerability as a founder who obviously has an insight into every aspect of the business.
Yeah.
And then speaking that out to the right stakeholders so that you're able to get the best insights that can then help you solve that problem.
That's right.
I think that's the key role of any founder is, and in that process of being vulnerable as well, it's, you're actually being such an important role model champion, because most often the perception that a lot of people have about a CEO or a founder is that they've got all the answers.
Right.
You've got to be right every time you walk into the room, and you don't have to. The fact that you can actually tell somebody that I don't have the answers and be vulnerable and kind of like show the side that we got to like row in that direction, but I just know that we have to row in the right direction, but I don't really know what that means, what that looks, what that feels, and we're going to experience that together. That is really difficult for a lot of founders to do.
Yeah. And it's, difficult for me to do sometimes. as well, because I think the thing is that you do need to project a lot of confidence. You do need to, once you have a plan, you need to encourage and evangelize and kind of like rally people to follow it, which requires projecting confidence, conviction. But you kind of need to do that at the same time as making it really clear, like, yeah, there's a lot of unknowns and there might be bets that you're making, risks you're taking, uncertainty that you're like accepting.
Yeah.
And trying to do both is like sometimes like a weird like mental exercise. And I personally don't think of it so much as like, vulnerability. I just think of it as, at the end of the day, it's the startup's job to like discover like the truth and go like solve problems. And you just can't do that if you can't actually have an environment in which like people can like be very direct about the challenges, right? So if you're in this situation where like you cannot actually be talking about the core problems you're facing, it's just really hard to get to the kind of like the heart of the matter. And so, my point is, you don't have to think about it as like, while I agree with you, like you are being vulnerable, you're showing other people that that's okay. But even from a pragmatic perspective, it's like, well, you can't solve the problem until you like acknowledge it. So I think that it's also just about the fastest path to solving your challenges.
Yeah, or you're isolating the problem just to the founding team.
Yeah.
At that point of time, again, that's not helpful because you're 2, 3, 4 in some contexts.
Yeah.
And that's not enough for you to like find answers because that's just 4 data points.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a team that you're actually having these conversations with, their diversity of opinion, their insights that they may bring from previous experiences that may not be in the room at that point of time, that you're leaving out if you don't actually become that person.
Yeah.
And that's why it's really important to be, my word was vulnerable because I couldn't find a different word for it.
No, but you're right. Yeah, totally. And I think that actually brings up a really good point, which is that, sometimes it's not clear like how you slowly expand those rings of trust, right? Like when you're first starting a company, it's like you and your co-founders and then everybody else. But then at some point you get like, the early employees versus everybody else, or you might get like managers or leaders. Then it's like your direct leadership team, your executive team. So you end up with these like almost like rings, and it's hard to kind of create those deliberately or manage those and understand like when to leverage which ring and like how to communicate across those. So again, all learning by trial and error.
Yeah, I mean, I love the whole process of trial and error because that actually goes to show that you've really gotten your hands dirty. You're also you're also willing to admit that, hey, there are mistakes that I've made in the process.
Yeah.
As opposed to just saying I'm learning off of somebody's experience using somebody else's playbook. In some cases that may work.
Yeah.
But in terms of applicability, it's going to look very different. Like your insights, I could probably take it, but when I apply it to like my company, it's going to look completely different.
Yeah.
And that in itself is going to be a unique experience for me.
Yeah.
And when I communicate that to somebody else, maybe it looks and takes a different shape and form when they apply it. So I think there's merit in learning, but also there's a lot of merit in like doing, failing, and trying to like iterate quickly as you do with your product, as you do with your company. And also it comes down to like your own experience of trying to be like a better leader and how do you improve on that?
Yeah. I think there's this kind of like trope where if you ask startup advice for 4 people, you're going to get like 4 different answers on the same problem. And like, I think it's very true because everything is so context dependent. Everything is so specific to the situation. The same exact advice can be right or wrong depending on the scenario. I think what helps is sometimes reminding yourself that like no one has really ever been in the situation you are in with the context you have at this point in time in this industry with these set of people. And that can be very helpful to like almost avoid this kind of mentality of like, you feeling like you need to have all the certainty before making any decisions, because the reality is like there is no certainty because so by definition variables. There's like these, not only are there so many variables, but these set of variables in this like sequence have never existed anywhere else. So there is no like perfect kind of like formula or answer you can derive from them,
Right.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree more with you. I think everybody's context is different and it'll keep changing with time. I'm sure somebody listens to this episode a year from now, it's going to sound so different, and it's going to be it's going to be unique in the context of which they're listening to.
Yeah.
And it's going to be very different when they start applying maybe some of the things that they learn from it. And as we were talking about it earlier, right?
Yeah.
When I was reading about your story and doing research, I did find a couple of parallels to like how our initial journey started.
Right.
Then of course how you went about doing things are obviously
Totally
a little different from like how we did, and
Yeah.
our learnings and your growth, all of that kind of like is obviously different.
Right.
But you can obviously draw parallels to somebody's journey a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, if you were looking back at your journey again, and we've talked about some of the learnings that you've had,
Yeah.
I love asking founders the things that they felt they could have done better. I don't typically put it across as failures or things that, because I think everything is a learning experience, and of course when you look back you have the luxury of hindsight and you're like, I could have done this better.
Yeah.
If there were 3 or 4 things that you would do differently if you were starting material today, and I'm not taking technology into it, I'm just talking about process, people, stuff like that, what would you do differently this time around?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is, like I feel like the hardest thing in startups is timing, because you're either always early or late. You never feel like you're on time with anything, right? Yeah. Whether it's like fundraising, hiring, like product launches, whatever. Like you always feel like, oh, I should have done this earlier, or man, maybe I was premature, I should have done this later. And kind of like hoping you get it right on time is almost like hoping you win the lottery. It's like, yeah, it could happen, but probably it's not. Yeah. Like you're either going to be early or late. And so for us, like I think that we were like a little late to expanding out of like the core. We had a as a founding team, we had a lot of trust. We kind of like had a lot of like skills within the team in terms of we could, we're comfortable doing some sales. We could do product development. We could fundraise, things like that. I think we were slow to build out like the next rank of like a senior leadership team. We got there eventually, but I think in hindsight, that's something we probably should have done a little earlier. Now, as I say that, I know that there's a risk of being premature with that, and like plenty of founders I've spoken to have the opposite experience where they did it too early and kind of that had its own consequences. So like I said, timing is very hard, but in hindsight for us, I think we were a little late to it. And
is that only because you felt that the talent existed in-house, or was it something else that kind of like impacted that decision?
I think it was more just that I feel like we could have gone faster if we didn't make ourselves bottlenecks in certain things. And we were bottlenecks only because we hadn't yet like brought in like the right leadership or delegated out or like let go of the Legos in some ways. So that was one. I think, when we started the company, we had a very, very, very different take on the email security problem. And even today, I think we're still evangelizing that approach sometimes, because like it takes time for like, especially in a place like security where best practices are very well understood, but they also take a lot of time to get accepted as best practices, right? We kind of felt like we were in the early days sort of like evangelizing a new approach. And I think you have to do that, but you have to do that while meeting the market where it is. Like you can't stubbornly stay where you are and just be like, hey, come over here. I think you have to sort of like create a path for like the market to find where it is today and like see how they like kind of get to some of what you're saying as well. And so very, very concretely, what I mean is like, let's say there's like 3 use cases that are adjacent to yours. You might feel like the third use case is the one that like is really important, really matters. That's how everybody should be thinking about it. And as you were saying earlier, right? Like you, by definition in a startup, you have like some strong opinion on how people should be framing the problem or how they should be thinking, how they should prioritize their resources and time. And that's important. I think it just sometimes needs to be coupled with understanding where they are today, like what are their priorities right now, right, and finding a way to bridge that. Because I think otherwise, you sort of get your like sort of early adopters, you get the people who agree with your vision, but then like by the time you're trying to like appeal to the broader market, you may have trouble, right? And so I think for us, again, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we probably would have like understood some of the adjacent use cases to our original idea earlier and kind of like, even though they may not be as unique or as novel, they're like use cases that existed.
Yeah.
And we probably, in hindsight, could have built those out sooner to act as a sort of bridge to the things that we do want to like uniquely show up in the market as. So that was another one that I think comes to mind in terms of not quite the tech, but just like the approach from a strategic. And it's hard because like, on the other hand, you could say like as a startup, you should be focusing on like your unique thing and like really nailing that. But I think the reality is that that will take you up to some point, but like you do have to sort of cross the chasm and like appeal to like a broader base. So
right.
Yeah.
I find that very interesting because in the same context, I think about founders who have, I mean, I hate using this terminology, but unicorn status, it doesn't mean anything. But what it actually means, in my opinion, is it's experience.
Yeah.
It's experience of scaling companies more than anything else, because that paper valuation probably doesn't mean too much to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But what it really means is you've had that growth with very few companies experience in their lifetime. If you take a look at just stats of how many companies get built versus how many companies have reached the status, it's less than about 6% of companies who get there.
Yeah.
Now, you being part of that unique club also gives you access to learnings of other companies who are either in the same field or who have been ahead of you, who are now there faster than you, and there've been stories of, I mean, not stories, but more so of, we've seen companies getting there in about record times in a couple of months.
Yeah.
Then what we had previously seen, 9 months, people are hitting those valuations and so on and so forth. But what it really does to you as a founder is it kind of opens up a different avenue and different way of thinking about how do I scale, how do I grow from here on, right? Because getting to like, let's say whatever number, 300, 200, 1,000, or $1 billion, and so on and so forth. Now, as you're thinking about the next stage, you're not obviously going to be building the company the same way that you got it from 0 to $1 billion. You'll be now thinking about building it. My ambition is 5, 10, whatever the next number is. The way that you're going to build it from this stage onto the next is going to look very, very different. So how are you thinking about what the next stage of material is going to look like? And I'm not talking about just numbers. I'm not talking about what the valuation is, what the revenue is, but how are you going to build this company differently now, not even taking AI into the picture, because I think that changes the answer and the context a little bit more, but just in terms of how you look back at the company building journey so far.
Yeah. I think that probably the most important thing is that, as I was saying earlier, like I think you start getting a much better understanding of where are you uniquely positioned in the market, what segments do you serve, where do you not serve. And I think what happens is like as your company gets bigger and more mature, as you collect more customers, you almost like need that volume of data or experience to understand where should you focus more, where should you double down, and where should you maybe like not lean in as much. Or avoid altogether. And I think that the way I think about it is that it's simultaneously like a narrowing in some sense, because you're getting more focused about what you do and don't do. But at the end, but also a broadening, because for that narrower like audience, you're trying to figure out, well, if this is really who I'm going to focus on, what other problems do they have, right? And like just not just from like a revenue and a TAM perspective, but just from the perspective of continuing to like solve more use cases, continuing to expand your impact or footprint inside a customer. You want to understand them and their use cases better. But you can only really do that if you're at the same time kind of narrowing and focusing and saying, this is who I want to be like really, really catering to. So I think from a, go-to-market or like product roadmap, things like that, I think that's kind of how I think about the next stage, which is like, where do we really want to double down? What are the use cases we really want to prioritize? And it's very counterintuitive, I think, because I think when people imagine companies getting bigger or like their next stages, they're only thinking about this broadening.
Yeah.
But I personally believe, and maybe this is just biased by the current situation that like our specific company's in, but I feel like it actually has to be a narrowing as well as a broadening, if that makes sense. So that's kind of one thing. And then it's really, I think that the danger of like misalignment within the company internally becomes just larger, right? Like as you're bigger, like you have competing incentives, initiatives, sometimes opinions on what to do. And I think the sort of like inertia of the company is to sort of like separate out and like for things to diverge, and you're kind of like more trying to converge them at all times. And then it sounds cliche, but I think you do have to spend more time on not just like the strategy and the product, but like the people, and just, you know, like who are you bringing on that's going to be able to sort of enforce the same values you care about. Who are the people who are going to give you like a ton of leverage? Who are folks that have like the experience needed for like the next set of stages? So I think the mentality shifts a little bit to sort of like these indirect levers rather than like the direct levers but also like, you know, just to not romanticize it too much, I think at the end of the day, like a lot of the job is the same, you know, it's like, you're still like kind of grinding, and like, you know, it's like thinking about like one deal at a time, and like, you know, like one milestone at a time. So I think that for me personally, at least right now, it doesn't feel like, oh, okay, there's like a dramatically different way to think about the job. I think it's just more like you're kind of like continuing to do a lot of the same things, but just maybe looking for like indirect levers.
Yeah, I think I really love the positioning there where you said narrow and broaden, because to me, what I took away from that was you saying it's so easy to get distracted today, especially when you get to a stage and where we are at this point of time with everything that's happening with AI. I kind of have to bring AI into the context now.
Yeah.
Because it's what everybody's thinking about. It's what everybody wants to hear. It's what employees at companies are thinking about, like, how are we going to leverage this?
Yeah.
And that's happening. If you talk about it or not, everyone's kind of like, it's on top of everybody's minds.
Sure.
It's not getting distracted while having laser focus on what are the one or two things that we can do for our core customer base. Because it's not just the problem of email security. Within email security as well, there's a bunch of different things that they're facing on a day-to-day. How do we like uncover more insights from that rather than looking at and saying, oh, we can do like the 10 other things as well. Of course you can do 10 other things, but you're going to like stray so much away from what you've built and what you've done that it's the chances of success or the chances of taking a risk on something like that and then risking the reputation and everything that you've done for the last 7 or 8 years is a massive there's a massive downside to that, as opposed to just the upside in getting distracted away. And which is why I think it's so easy, which in the early days we kind of like tend to do this quite a lot. There's the rate of experimentation is so high that you're okay with things failing or things, you know, a couple of things clicking, because then gives you the luxury, as did you guys have when you were initially testing out the thesis. But now the rate of experimentation has to be so curated and narrowed down that it has to focus around the core problem, the core of what the company is doing, as opposed to other things that you could possibly do. But you don't really have the luxury at this point of time.
And like, you know, it's luxury, and it's also things that like compound, right? So like if you are focusing on like the same, you know, customer base with like few different adjacent use cases or features, it's just like the value of them compounds. Whereas if you're like diluting those efforts across 4 or 5 different profiles of segment or customer you're trying to serve, then it becomes harder. You know, you're like by definition, you're not having as much impact on any one of them. So I think that I think that journey is, it like sounds so obvious, but I really do think that it's actually pretty hard to really, it's like another form of let go of the Legos, because it's like, it is sometimes can feel like, you know, segments of the market or specific use cases or areas where you actually have something, but you're kind of deliberately choosing not to double down on. And that can feel uncomfortable, right? Because like there are things that are like within reach, that you've done them in the past. But I think that in terms of like looking to the next stage, building, like you kind of do need some sort of narrowing and focusing. So I think that's one of the key things top of mind for me.
I love that. And, you know, typically towards the end of the conversation, I end up asking most founders 1 or 2 questions, and I'll pose both, and you get to choose which one you want to like answer, or maybe both. The first one typically is, you know, asking them to like pick one piece of advice that they would give a younger self, if knowing that that this is going to be the path that you're going to be on, what is that one or two things that you would ask your younger self to do? And the second is generic advice that you want to give other founders who are trying to build something in security or in generic today. So this could either turn out to be like a same thing, like it could be a same answer that you want to give everybody else as well as yourself, or it could be two different answers.
Yeah. I think advice to younger self, I think like honestly, probably the most, and this has been said by many people, so not unique in any way, but like I think one of the hardest things is just managing your own energy and managing your own like stress levels or just like emotional kind of state. And I think, it's almost like helpful to think about things as like, people talk a lot about the highs and lows of startups, right? And they say the highs are high and the lows are low. Like it's a very common trope.
The highs are also very few.
Yeah.
The more lows than highs.
But I think, the maybe edit that I would make is like, actually the highs aren't as high as you thought at the time and the lows aren't as low as you thought at the time, right? With the benefit of like, sort of like experience looking back, you're like, actually at the time I thought that was like a crisis and like, it was bad, but like, we kind of got through it. Or like, we thought this was like the greatest thing ever. And actually it turned out to be like, okay, it wasn't like as impactful as we thought. So I think in a weird way, just like remembering that your kind of like current sort of reactions to whatever is going on are sort of transient. It's almost this like stoicism that I think you need to adopt as a founder because it is a long journey. It's very easy to get exhausted. I think managing your energy is probably like the number one job, and many different people have different ways of dealing with that. But at the end of the day, I think that is like probably the hardest thing. And for me personally, sort of like compartmentalizing and specifically like kind of preventing myself from feeling like any given thing was like either the greatest thing in the world or like the worst thing in the world. It was like a thing I had to learn.
Yeah.
As far as like founders building in security or in general, I mean, I'll give some advice specific to security. I think that the biggest problem in security, in my opinion, in the industry, and it explains so much about the industry, is that it is extremely difficult to measure value. And the reason for that is actually like there's one of my favorite papers. It was recommended to me by a friend when I first started in the security world. It's this paper called Market for Silver Bullets, and it's this economics paper that is actually analyzing the security industry. And there's kind of all these like effects in the market that this paper talks about that are all downstream of one fact, which is that there is a lot of information asymmetry. Typically in markets, you see an asymmetry between the buyer and seller. Like buyer has more information than the seller, or seller has more information than the buyer. The point of this paper is that in the security market, neither the buyer nor the seller have enough information because there's a third party, which is the attacker, right? Yeah. And that means very, very tactically that as a builder in security, you might genuinely believe your solution adds value. But the thing is, you cannot be sure exactly what value it adds because it is difficult to know what like an attacker might do. And similarly, as a buyer of a solution, you can do like as much evaluation testing as you want, but ultimately you cannot be like sure what the value of this tool will be until you face like a real.
Because you will get attacked at some point.
Yeah, and like maybe it will have the impact you expected. Maybe it won't. Like you're trying your best to estimate that, but you cannot say for sure.
Yeah.
Which, if you think about it, is different from other markets where like a buyer is able to do their evaluation or their like calculus and make an informed decision, and then it's just like less likely that they're going to be completely surprised. So all that is to say, what I think this results in is, first of all, like lots and lots and lots of vendors, right? Lots of different takes to the same sort of problem. There's a lot of red oceans in security. And I think proving out value is hard. And so if you're like a early stage founder thinking about security, I would say like probably one of the first things that I would think about is like, how are you going to demonstrate value of your solution? How are you going to give buyers like confidence that, in an event that is like a negative event, it's actually going to help and do what it says it's going to do. And how will you deal with some of like the externalities that result from this, right? So for example, there's like a lot of herd mentality in the security industry. There's a lot of like people kind of following, established practices, even if like those practices may not make sense in their particular context, just because, it's like, it is the practice to follow. And like, you don't want to be the one person who's not following that. So I think in security in particular, it's just very important to be aware of these market dynamics because I think they are somewhat unique.
I love both the pieces of advice that you've given, because the first one I relate to it a little bit more, because I felt every time I've had a low point in life, I've always had a lower point that's come at a different point later in the future. So I'm like, every time I have a low point now, I'm like, you know what, this is not going to be the lowest. The lowest is yet to come. So keep waiting. This is okay. So that's the only consolation that I keep telling myself. That kind of makes me feel a little better about any low point that I have in life, that I know that a lower one is yet to arrive.
It's a little pessimistic.
But it helps me get through.
Yeah, that's funny.
That's a good note to like end the episode on. Thank you so much. I think this was such a riveting conversation, especially because we got to live the journey that you have had building material with your co-founders and having walked us through what the early days look like, because a lot of founders today, many founders in the AI space have had either a crazy story or a lot of people are still trying to like figure out what the journey is. And within security, I know this a little bit more because I have a lot of my peer group right now with a lot of security founders who have had a very difficult path. They're trying to like validate thesis. It takes longer time within the industry. To hear stories like this, that kind of like gives people a little bit of solace in some fact that, hey, we're taking a little bit of time, but we're being methodical in the way that we go about our company building and how we discover our customers. So this is actually very helpful to founders like those who are who kind of feel that it's the end of the world if in 3 months they haven't figured out what their product is. It doesn't have to be that way. I really know people who are going through a very difficult time 5 months into building a company and figuring out, oh shit, I've raised money and now we have to pivot and it feels like end of the world. So hopefully it gives them more conviction that, hey, there are companies that have been built that have taken a little bit of time, but have been thoughtful. There's a way to go about it. So thanks for sharing that journey. I hope it inspires more founders.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And that job never ends. I think, I think you could talk to like public company CEOs. They probably still feel like they're figuring these things out. So yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here. This is great.
Yeah.